Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, geopolitical tensions in the Middle East are escalating, but how would a wider conflict affect the economies of the parties involved, and what are the ramifications globally? A surprise economic stimulus in China. Beijing has announced big monetary stimulus measures to try to revive its slowing economy, but will it work? And Zimbabwe's new gold-backed ZiG is devalued and weakening further. Is the nation facing yet another currency crisis, or can it succeed in stabilizing its economy? Middle East tensions are ratcheting up, bringing the region closer towards an all-out war. The geopolitical risk rose after Iran launched a major ballistic missile attack targeting sites across Israel. The escalation comes almost a year after Israel started its war on Gaza. Now, a widening war in the region could carry heavy costs for the parties involved, including economic and humanitarian losses. The long-term effects could also have serious ramifications for the global economy. We'll discuss that with our guest shortly, but first, let's take a look at what's at stake here. The price of oil is traditionally sensitive to every twist and turn in geopolitical tensions. Brent crude, the international benchmark oil price, rose as much as 5% to more than $75 a barrel after Iran's attack. Gold prices also rose. Now, Iran is a major oil producer, supplying around 3% of world output, despite Western sanctions that have crippled its economy. It also has influence over the Strait of Hormuz, which handles more than 30% of global oil trade. Those supplies could be disrupted. Trade routes in the Red Sea are also at risk after several attacks by Houthi rebels on ships passing through the waterway. Egypt's Suez Canal, though, through which 12% of global trade passes, could also suffer disruption. Lebanon and Syria are the most vulnerable nations to economic losses. The Lebanese government is in desperate need of aid, while the Syrian government can't afford the humanitarian response to the influx of refugees from Lebanon. Israel's war on Gaza has already sparked an unprecedented humanitarian crisis in the Strip, while attacks by the Israeli army and settlers have ground the economy in the occupied West Bank to a halt. The cost of the war on Gaza has hurt Israel's economy significantly. Vital economic sectors are at a standstill. Borrowing has rocketed, while revenues have slumped. Credit rating agency Moody's downgraded the nation for a second time, bringing it closer to non-investment grade. Neighbouring countries, including Jordan and Egypt, which depend on tourism and trade, could see a decline in their revenues due to the disruption of supply chains. Unemployment could also rise, and that could hurt their economies even further. Well, joining us now from Doha is Ahmed Halal, who's an economic and political risk analyst and Middle East and North Africa director at the Global Council. Ahmed, good to have you with us. Again, let's start with the price of oil, which rose, around 4% after Iran's missile attack on Israel, but had fallen about 10% over the last 3 months, with OPEC warning recently that the price would remain weak. What might happen to the price of oil if the conflict widens, especially if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, what we've seen is the return of the geopolitical risk premium to the price of oil. As you said, it shot up by about 7% following the tit-for-tat confrontation. But until that point, markets had largely shrugged off what's happening in the Middle East. Now is different. The conflict is widening, and Iran could decide that its next step is to retaliate against Israel could retaliate against Iranian energy infrastructure, which would take off around $2 million barrels of Iranian oil from international oil markets, which would lead prices to go up by $80 and even reach $100. That said, we've got high inventory. We've got about 5 million barrels of oil in spare capacity between the large oil producers. Those can be brought online to offset the loss of Iranian production, which would help stabilize oil prices. But there's no doubt that the risk premium, geopolitical risk premium to oil prices has returned and has caught oil traders who thought that the market was bearish, caught them off guard.
And if oil does go to $80, $100 a barrel, what will be the impact on global inflation? Of course, many central banks around the world are just beginning to get a handle on inflation right now.
And it would undermine the progress that central banks have been achieving. They have begun a rate cutting cycle. The ECB has, the United States Federal Reserve has. an inflationary shock would happen if oil was to go up to 80 or 100. The last time it did was in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctioning of Russian oil, and it added a percentage point to global inflation. And this would have knock-on effects on other parts of the economy. Oil prices affects manufacturing, it affects food and fertilizer prices, so it would have second and third order effects on the global economy, just as it's starting to mount a recovery.
As we've reported several times in the last few weeks on Counting the Cost, Israel's economy has been hurt quite badly by its war on Gaza and would be hurt further still by a wider conflict. What about other economies in the region? Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. What would be the impact of a wider conflict on them? Could their economies withstand it, especially Lebanon?
Lebanon and Syria are two sides of the same coin. Their economies are interconnected, they're intertwined, they share a very porous border. Both countries are reeling from long-time economic crises. Syria goes back to a 10-year, decade-old civil war. It's got a failing state. Lebanon's banking system, when it collapsed, not only affected the Lebanese currency, but also the Syrian crisis. You have a refugee crisis. You've got 37% of the Lebanese population today made up of Syrian refugees. And then you have in Lebanon today an internal displacement crisis that involves 1 million Lebanese moving from southern regions to flee the fighting, which is going to only further strain the creaking social infrastructure of the Lebanese state. And you have between those two countries now a parallel economy or an informal economy or an illicit economy. You have, for example, a thriving narcotics trade between the corruption and patronage networks that tie the two countries together, and which has led to, for example, Lebanon's exports of fruits and vegetables being banned to major markets in the Gulf because of things like captagon, a narcotic being found inside these goods. So it has been devastating for both economies, and both economies are mirror images of each other.
And what about the economies of Jordan and Egypt?
Jordan is heavily dependent on foreign aid. It hasn't been affected directly by the crisis. Of course, you have tourism being hit. You've got, but Egypt is a bigger story. Egypt is reeling from the worst economic crisis in decades. It has just is certainly not nearly out of the woods. It's accepted foreign aid from the EU, a stimulus package from the IMF, big investments from Saudi and the UAE. Investment is just about starting to come in, but Egypt is not out of the woods. Its fundamentals haven't changed, and the war has affected Egypt in material ways. So you've got a year-on-year loss of about 20% revenue from the Suez Canal, which is an important source of hard currency for Egypt, and its tourism sector, which was just recovering from the shocks of COVID and Russia-Ukraine, is being affected.
And what about the impact
by the instability and nonsensical panic?
And what about the impact of a wider conflict on global trade routes? For instance, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal.
Well, I think the global trade routes and logistics have recalibrated. Costs are significantly higher. The Red Sea continues to be out of bound for most shipping. The Houthis have not relented in their attacks on Red Sea shipping. That has had inflationary effects that by now have been baked into global inflation. So I think that will only continue, and especially if you combine that with higher oil prices, that will have second-order inflationary effects on the global economy.
Global markets seem to have taken things pretty much in their stride, as you were saying earlier. They're quite sanguine. For the moment, there's been no big rush to safe havens. How long would that last, or how quickly could things change if a wider conflict were to begin?
Well, I think the impact is going to be coming from oil prices, right? It affects chemicals, it affects sectors across the world, manufacturing, and that's going to really hit the recovery in its tracks. It's going to force central banks to keep interest rates higher, and that's what we have to really focus on. If the interest rates remain higher and price at the pump for consumers goes up, the central banks will have to pause in the rate cutting cycle, and that's going to affect the recovery in a big way. And it's going to be also politically sensitive. In an election year for the US, Israel and Iran might have delivered an October surprise for the US elections. If it's going to make it very hard for the Harris campaign to win voters when the price at the pump is going up, when energy production is really becoming a lightning rod political issue in the US, in a battleground states that are producing energy in the United States. So increase in oil prices because of Middle East conflicts have wide-ranging effects on the global economy.
Ahmed, good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
China's younger workers are finding it hard to get a job. Businesses are struggling to pay off debts. The wealth of the Chinese people has been depleted by slumping home prices. Investor confidence is depressed, and Beijing's trade relations with the West are strained. Chinese leaders, worried about the sputtering economy, are pulling out all the stops. The central bank unveiled a series of economic stimulus measures last week. It was seen as the boldest attempt to revive economic growth. But is it going to work? We'll discuss that with our guest in a moment. But first, Kulsum Sharif reports.
China's marking the 75th anniversary of its foundation this year. The milestone comes as its stock markets have soared for over a week after China's central bank announced some of its boldest measures in years, aimed at reviving the world's second-largest economy, including a cut in interest rates.
I take the opportunity to announce the following policies. First, reduce the reserve requirement ratio and the policy interest rate and drive the market benchmark interest rate downward. Second, we will lower the interest rate on existing mortgages and unify the minimum down payment ratio for mortgages. Third, create new monetary policy tools to support the stable development of the stock market.
The new measures are aimed particularly at reviving a sector that slowed China's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The property sector has been ailing for years after a government crackdown on excessive borrowing for projects. The prolonged slump affected other parts of the economy, from construction to sales of home appliances. Analysts say the mortgage rate cut will boost consumer sentiment and prop up the property market.
The cut releases two signals. The first is to boost residents' consumption, and the second is to stabilize the declining real estate market. It effectively reassures families with existing house loans, which is beneficial for helping the real estate market stabilize quickly and avoid impacting residents' consumption.
The major Chinese cities, Shanghai, Guangzhou and Shenzhen, have eased their home buying restrictions. But concerns remain over high levels of debt among households and businesses, which could limit the effectiveness of the measures. Ahead of the National Day holiday, authorities stepped up efforts to encourage consumer spending, from exhibitions displaying clean energy vehicles to promotions for furniture and smart homeware.
Customers can receive a subsidy of up to 20% when trading in old homeware. Additionally, in line with the consumption surge during the holiday, we have introduced a new batch of environmentally friendly smart home devices featuring high-cost performance.
Chinese stocks had their best one-day rally since 2008 on September 30th. But China's factory activity shrank for a fifth straight month in September, and the services sector also slowed sharply. The stimulus package has boosted the morale of consumers and businesses. But Beijing may need additional bold moves if it's to meet its 5% growth target for 2024. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Joining us now from Shanghai is Sean Ryan. He's the founder and managing director of China Market Research Group, a leading strategic market intelligence firm focused on China, and author of the book The Split. Sean, good to have you with us. So the government wants to restore confidence in the economy and encourage investment and spending. Is this package of measures enough to do that, or is it just a starting point? Do you see more to come?
It's great to be here. If you know my background, I've been in China for 27 years. And for the first 25, I was one of the biggest bulls on China. But for the last 2 years, I've become one of the biggest bears. And so it's great that the Chinese government has launched what I consider to be a mini stimulus to help rebuild confidence, help get the stock equity markets booming again, try to see if we can get some things happening in the real estate market. And that's all great. I still think the stock market can go up another 10, 20% over the next 1 to 3 weeks. But here's the question. I'm not sure that this mini stimulus is enough to really fix some of the structural problems that are inherent in the Chinese economy today. We have to remember that 30% of the economy used to be based off of real estate. We're now looking for new drivers of growth, which Xi Jinping and the CPC call new productive forces, things like manufacturing in EVs, manufacturing in batteries. The problem, though, is as China gets stronger in NEVs, you're seeing the Western world getting very nervous. You know, the Biden regime has slapped 100% tariffs on Chinese NEVs. The vassal Justin Trudeau from Canada has also slapped 100%. And you also see 18 to 38% tariffs in Europe. So the problem is the stimulus is great to regain investor confidence, but at some point, it's very hard for China's economy to actually grow because the drivers that are supposed to take the place and substitute real estate are being contained by the Western imperial powers.
Okay, so it's just a sticking plaster for the moment. But what were the risks of inaction for China? Was it risking perhaps becoming like Japan and staring down the barrel of a decade of stagflation?
Yeah, we've already dealt with basically 4 lost years in China. We are facing a lost decade economically. You know, income levels are really low. That's why you have an 18.8% unemployment rate in August for Chinese youth. So we're facing serious issues. The Chinese government had to launch a mini stimulus, but here's the problem. It's run out of money. A lot of local governments have become overly indebted because of very expensive zero COVID policies that they had to adhere to during the COVID era. There's very little tax revenue. So actually what's happened is a lot of local governments are going around to profitable companies and saying, please donate money to local tax authorities because we need to raise money. They're also going along to a lot of wealthy people and saying, you know what, 10, 20 years ago, you were corrupt, you did something illegal, we'll let you go if you pay a fine. But it's very clear that the government had to launch a stimulus in order to regain confidence, but we're also just kicking some of the problems down the road. We need to deal with structural reforms. We need to get youth unemployment down. We need to fix labor market laws so it's easier to hire and fire employees. And most importantly, is we have to make sure that we have stable income. Because even if you have a stimulus where stocks go up, people aren't going to go out and spend if they're not sure if stocks are going to continue to go up. They need to make sure that they know in 2025 or in 2026, their income levels are going to be the same, if not higher than in 2024. Until we see stable income levels, I don't think you're going to have the consumer confidence to go out and spend a lot. Right now, we're in Golden Week in China, big holiday week. Hotel prices and air ticket prices are down 20% year on year because the confidence to spend just isn't there.
And very briefly, Sean, is this stimulus package at least enough to lift the moribund property sector, which has caused so many problems, of course, for China's economy?
I think it's enough to lift equities, and that's why you see institutional investors from around the world, from David Tepper to Fidelity to Capital Group, are rushing into China, but I'm not convinced it's enough to uplift the moribund real estate sector, as you call it, because people still, even if mortgage rates are lower, even if down payment levels are lower, people are not going to buy homes if they think that prices are going to continue to drop. I hope we've reached bottom, but I don't think we've reached bottom anytime soon in real estate.
Sean, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Official data published in Argentina says that more than half its 46 million people are living in poverty. That's a rise of more than 5 million this year alone. These are the first official figures published since Javier Milei became president last December. Daniel Schweimler in the capital Buenos Aires looks now at how those figures translate into reality for millions of Argentinians.
Poverty is nothing new in Argentina, which has lurched from one economic crisis to another over the past 60 years or so. But what the figures published by the State Statistics Office Index show is that 53% of the population now live below the poverty line, can't afford basic food items. That's an increase of more than 5 million this year. 2/3 of them are under 14 years old.
It hurts me a lot because of the kids. The kids are a different issue. And I may not have much, but the little that I have, I try to sometimes give them a piece of chicken, buy large boxes of milk to at least give them some milk, even though I have so little.
Wages have not kept pace with annual inflation of more than 230%, one of the worst in the world. This means people are working the same hours for less, while prices rise almost daily. And this on top of government cuts to subsidies for fuel, health, transport and welfare programmes.
Since this government took office, our work has dropped off. We work twice as much for less. At my age, I'm not getting hired anywhere else except maybe dragging a cart and nothing more. So I keep pushing forward.
Pedro sells Hecho in Buenos Aires, a magazine to help those in precarious living conditions.
I get help from the neighbours. I sell the magazine. I've got my job.
But he, like millions of others, is living on the edge, barely able to feed his 8 children.
We're here planning how to resist what's happening. This is a place of resistance, one of the trenches where we're trying to ensure everything doesn't fall apart.
Javier Milei took office in December, promising to drastically cut public spending to tame Argentina's rampant inflation. His government blames the poverty on previous administrations. The rescue, he said, would take time. The markets, the IMF and millions of Argentinians still support him, although latest polls show his popularity is waning. This was once one of the richest countries in the world, certainly one of the wealthiest in Latin America. But now major crises follow minor booms. There's no stability, and an impatient population turns to ever more eccentric leaders who promised instant solutions. President Milei hasn't delivered one of those, not yet. With each day that passes, more Argentinians wonder when, if he'll deliver, or whether the seemingly endless round of economic crises is set to continue. Daniel Schweimler, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost in Buenos Aires.
It is the country's 6th currency in 25 years. The gold-backed ZiG was launched 6 months ago in an attempt to tackle a long-running currency crisis and inflation. But Zimbabwe gold was devalued by more than 40% against the dollar last week. The move by the central bank to slash the local exchange rate of its currency signals persistent trouble in the nation's economy. The ZiG replaced the Zimbabwean dollar, which had crashed several times since being reintroduced 5 years ago. Previous attempts to stabilize the currency were undermined by the central bank, printing money to finance government borrowing. The Zimbabwean dollar suffered one of the world's worst crashes to date in 2009. The government was printing $10 trillion notes, and hyperinflation was running at 5 billion%. The nation's president has vowed to implement measures to stop the currency sliding. Joining us now from Harare in Zimbabwe is Prosper Chitambara, who's a development economist and senior researcher for the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute for Zimbabwe. Prosper, good to talk to you again. So why has the central bank devalued the ZiG? Why has the public in Zimbabwe failed to embrace it?
Well, I think your first question, they have devalued it to allow for market forces of demand and supply to have a greater say in terms of exchange rate determination. As you also know, the parallel market rate was also depreciating, so the premium was actually widening. So the central bank, through the Monetary Policy Committee, has decided to adopt a more liberal exchange rate. So that has actually necessitated the devaluation that we have seen. And that devaluation, my view is that it's also being driven by the huge mismatch in terms of the demand for the USD and the available supply. So I think that is pushing pressure, obviously, on the exchange rate. People have not yet fully embraced the Zimbabwe gold, given the challenges that we have had in the past with respect to chronic high inflation as well as hyperinflation. So in terms of the trust and confidence in the ZiG, there's still a huge gap and deficit that the central bank and the fiscal authorities have to work on in terms of filling up.
Prosper, when you say that the central bank wants to take a more liberal approach to the exchange rate, does that mean that the ZiG will be allowed to float freely on currency markets, or are they still going to control the exchange rate?
Well, they are moving towards allowing a more a free float to some extent, maybe not a 100% free float, because the central bank still maintains the 25% surrender requirement. So there are still some controls within the foreign exchange management system. But what we are hearing is that they want to allow market forces of demand and supply to have a greater say in terms of the pricing of foreign exchange in Zimbabwe.
6 currencies in 25 years. Why has the central bank been unable to get a handle on the country's economic and monetary policy? To what extent is the government the biggest threat here to its own currency and its own economy?
Yes. I think our biggest challenge is emanated largely from lack of fiscal discipline. So in other words, we have failed to control public spending to within sustainable levels. So we have run deficits for the longest of times. And we have actually used the central bank overdraft facility to finance those deficits. So that has created inflationary pressures within the economy. So I would say ultimately our biggest challenge relates to the lack of fiscal discipline, but also lack of monetary discipline. So money supply growth rate has been very, very unsustainable. Even when you look at the numbers, between end of April this year and end of June this year, reserve money has actually increased by 30%, which is highly unsustainable given the state of our economy, which has been exacerbated by the drought. So Zimbabwe is currently facing a drought, which has affected agricultural production, the manufacturing sector, and also the softening of mineral commodity prices has also put a lot of pressure on our current account. So this year has been a very challenging year. And also because of the drought, we are experiencing rolling power outages.
Always good to talk to you, Prosper. Many thanks indeed for being with us again on Counting the Cost.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at @Finnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC, or you could drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. There's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.